Welcome to Terramouth, where the night doesn't just hold secrets, it remembers them.
The parade that watched back. The town of Red Hollow did not appear on any official Christmas event listings. It didn't advertise itself, didn't invite visitors, and didn't need to. People came anyway. Some said it was curiosity. Others blamed wrong turns, broken GPS signals, or sudden snowstorms that forced them off the highway. But when I started asking questions, a pattern emerged that no one wanted to admit. Everyone who came to Red Hollow for the Christmas Jesus parade had already lost someone. A brother. A wife. A child. Someone who vanished without explanation, leaving behind unfinished lives and unanswered questions. My reason was my brother, Evan. 3 years ago, Evan disappeared on Christmas Eve. He was a photographer, obsessed with documenting strange traditions in small towns. He believed forgotten places remembered things the rest of the world tried to bury. His last message to me came at 6:41 p.m., a photo taken at night, snow falling thickly, candlelight glowing against old wooden buildings. In the center of the frame stood a man wearing a white robe and a crown of thorns, struggling beneath the weight of a massive wooden cross. Beneath the photo, Evan typed 4 words. "You won't believe this." Then nothing. His phone never pinged again. When I traced the image's metadata, every digital path collapsed into a dead end, except one broken county map that still listed a place called Red Hollow. A town officially declared abandoned after a church fire in the 1970s. Yet here it was. Alive. Waiting. I arrived on December 24th just before sunset. Snow lined the roads in neat, unnatural drifts, as if placed deliberately. The town itself sat low in a valley, surrounded by skeletal trees stripped bare, their branches tangled together like grasping hands. Every house looked occupied, yet not a single light shone from the windows. Red Hollow felt paused. As though it was holding its breath. St. Abner's Church stood at the center, its steeple leaning at an angle that made my stomach tighten. The bell tower was empty. No bell. No rope. Just darkness inside. At exactly dusk, the first candle appeared. A woman stepped out of a side street, holding it chest high. Her face was pale, eyes unfocused. Then another candle. Then another. People emerged silently from homes, alleys, and shadows, forming lines without instruction. No one spoke above a whisper. That was when I saw him. The man playing Jesus. He walked at the front, barefoot in the snow, wearing a white robe already soaked dark at the hem. A crown of thorns dug deep into his scalp, blood trailing down his temples and freezing against his skin. His breathing was uneven, labored, and each step looked like it took everything he had left. The cross on his back was real. Thick. Heavy. Old wood stained black in places I didn't want to think about. As the procession moved, I noticed something deeply wrong. No one was celebrating. There was no joy. No singing. No reverence in the way I recognized from church parades or passion plays. The townspeople didn't watch with pride. They watched with focus. With scrutiny. Like farmers studying weather signs before a storm. They whispered as they walked. Not prayers. Instructions. Keep him steady. Don't let him collapse early. Watch his hands. The man stumbled, and the reaction was immediate. Several men stepped out of the crowd and grabbed his arms, not to help, but to correct. Their fingers dug into his skin, forcing him upright again. The man whimpered, a sound so quiet it barely escaped his throat. I felt sick. As the procession reached the town square, the man slowed. His head lifted slightly. His eyes scanned the crowd. Then they locked onto mine. His expression changed instantly, confusion twisting into terror, then something worse. Recognition. His lips moved. No sound came out, but I read it clearly. My name. Before I could step forward, the crowd surged, closing ranks between us. Candles were blown out one by one as the church doors creaked open. Darkness poured out of St. Abner's like a living thing. The man was dragged inside. The doors slammed shut. The square was silent again. No applause. No conclusion. Just emptiness. Later that night, driven by panic and something close to guilt, I broke into the church. Inside, there were no pews. No altar. No cross. The walls were stripped bare, scarred with old burn marks and something darker beneath. Behind the pulpit, carved deep into the wood, were names. Dozens of them. Some scratched lightly. Others gouged violently, as if carved by people desperate to be remembered. At the bottom, freshly cut, was my brother's name. Evan Carter. Below it was an empty space. Wide enough for one more. As I stepped back, the church doors creaked shut behind me. A voice whispered from the darkness, close to my ear. "You watched the parade. Pause. That means you understand what comes next." I didn't scream when the church doors closed behind me. I couldn't. The air inside St. Abner's felt thick, like breathing through wet cloth. The candles lining the walls weren't lit by flame, each one glowed faintly from within, casting shadows that moved independently of my body. Somewhere deep in the church, something creaked, slow and deliberate, as if the building itself was shifting its weight. "You watched the parade," the voice repeated. I spun around. No one was there. But the whisper hadn't come from the walls. It came from inside my head. I backed toward the exit, fumbling for the handle. It wouldn't move. The door wasn't locked, it simply wasn't there anymore. In its place was solid wood, seamless, as if the entrance had never existed. Then I heard footsteps. Bare feet on stone. Slow. Dragging. Familiar. A figure emerged from behind the pulpit, stepping into the candlelight. He wore the same white robe, now soaked through with blood and melted snow. The crown of thorns was gone, replaced by raw, torn flesh around his scalp. It was Evan. My brother looked older. Thinner. His eyes were sunken so deep they seemed hollowed out. He smiled when he saw me, not with relief, but with something like pity. "You shouldn't have come," he said softly. I rushed toward him, grabbing his shoulders. He felt cold. Not winter cold. Grave cold. "They're not letting us leave," he continued. "Not once we've carried it." "Carried what?" I asked. He gestured toward the back of the church. I followed his gaze. That's when I saw the crosses. They lined the walls in neat rows, dozens of them, each one marked with a name burned into the wood. Every name belonged to someone who had vanished. Journalists. Travelers. Grieving parents. Curious strangers. People like Evan. People like me. They choose someone every year, Evan said. Someone who's already cracked. Someone who's lost enough to carry the weight. The realization hit me like ice water. Jesus isn't the symbol, I whispered. Evan shook his head. He's the container. The church bells rang suddenly, deafening, though there were no bells in the tower. Outside, the town came alive. Footsteps. Murmurs. A gathering crowd. It's almost midnight, Evan said. That's when the old one wakes. The candles flared brighter. The floor beneath us trembled. From beneath the church came a sound like breathing, deep, vast, patient. Something enormous shifted below the foundations, pressing upward as if testing the weight of the world above it. They don't worship Jesus here, Evan continued. They feed something older. Something that wears belief like skin. Every year, it demands a story strong enough to keep it dreaming. I understood then. The parade wasn't a reenactment. It was a handoff. The church doors burst open. The townspeople flooded in, faces calm, eyes empty, hands already stained with old blood. They surrounded us in a perfect circle. "You watched," the woman with the first candle said. "That means you're ready." Men stepped forward, lifting a new cross from the floor. My name was already carved into it. Evan moved between me and them. "I'll do it again," he said quickly. "I can carry it another year." The crowd hesitated. Something beneath the church growled. "Hungry." "No," the voice inside my head said. "He's already hollow." Hands grabbed me. The weight of the cross crushed my chest as they strapped it onto my back. The wood burned my skin where it touched. I screamed then, but the sound was swallowed instantly. As they pushed me toward the exit, Evan grabbed my hand. "There's only one way out," he whispered. "You have to refuse to believe." The church doors opened onto the square. Snow fell in silence. The procession began again. Step by step, the cross grew heavier, not physically, but mentally. Memories flooded my mind. Not mine. Everyone's. Their losses. Their prayers. Their bargains whispered into the dark. I felt the thing beneath Red Hollow stirring, feeding on every desperate thought. Halfway through the square, I collapsed. The crowd froze. I didn't let them lift me. Instead, I laughed. It came out broken, hysterical, wrong. "I don't believe in you," I whispered into the snow. The sky cracked. Not thunder, something deeper. The candles went out. The crowd screamed for the first time. The cross splintered on my back, wood rotting instantly, collapsing into ash. Beneath the town, something howled in agony. The church imploded inward, sinking into the earth like a swallowed lie. The ground split open, and Red Hollow folded in on itself, houses, streets, people, dragged downward into darkness. When I woke, I was alone on an empty stretch of highway. No snow. No town. No Red Hollow. Authorities said nothing had ever been there. They never found Evan. But every Christmas Eve, just before midnight, I wake to the sound of distant footsteps. I smell candle smoke. I feel the weight on my shoulders again. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see a parade moving through a town that shouldn't exist. This time, I'm not watching. I'm walking. And something behind me is smiling. Waiting for me to believe again. Story 2. The man who walked ahead of Jesus. The first thing everyone noticed was that Jesus arrived early. In the town of Blackmere Falls, the Christmas Jesus parade had always followed strict timing. Bells at 6:30. Candles at 6:45. The procession began at exactly 7 p.m., when the church doors opened and the man portraying Jesus stepped out into the cold. Except this year, at 6:41 p.m., someone was already walking down Main Street. Barefoot. Silent. Alone. At first, people assumed it was a mistake, some eager volunteer, maybe drunk or confused. But the closer he came, the more uncomfortable the crowd became. Because he wasn't dressed like Jesus. He was dressed as someone who had already died for him. His robe was torn and stiff with dark stains. His skin was pale, stretched too tight across his face. His eyes were open, but unfocused, as if he were looking through everyone instead of at them. And around his neck hung a small wooden placard. Forgiveness was not enough. No one spoke. Not a single child cried. Not a single phone camera lifted. It was as if the town had collectively forgotten how to react. Then the church bells rang. And the real Jesus came out. Caleb Monroe stood near the bakery with his wife and daughter, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. He had grown up in Blackmere Falls. He knew every tradition. And this wasn't one of them. The man portraying Jesus, Brother Thomas, froze at the top of the church steps. His eyes locked onto the figure already halfway down Main Street. For a moment, neither moved. Then Brother Thomas whispered something Caleb couldn't hear, and stepped back inside the church. The doors slammed shut. The bells stopped mid-ring. The crowd gasped as the early walker stopped and slowly turned around. His face was wrong. Not deformed. Recognizable. Caleb felt ice crawl through his veins. He knew that face. Everyone did. It belonged to Jonah Pike. Jonah had been the town's favorite son, youth choir leader, volunteer firefighter, the man chosen every year to carry the ceremonial cross. 3 years ago, Jonah collapsed during the parade. They said it was a heart attack. They buried him on December 26th. Caleb attended the funeral. Caleb helped lower the coffin. Jonah Pike was dead. And yet here he was, walking back toward the church. People began whispering prayers. Someone screamed. Someone else fainted. But Jonah didn't acknowledge anyone. He walked with purpose, stopping directly in front of the locked church doors. He raised his hand. Knocked once. Twice. 3 times. From inside, a voice whispered, not amplified, not echoed. Terrified. We already gave you one. Jonah smiled. And that was when Caleb realized the third terrifying truth. Jonah wasn't smiling like a man. He was smiling like a door opening. The church doors creaked open. Inside, darkness pooled unnaturally thick, swallowing candlelight. Caleb saw shapes move inside, figures kneeling, shaking, pressing their foreheads to the floor. Jonah stepped inside. The doors slammed shut again. The bells resumed ringing as if nothing had happened. And Brother Thomas re-emerged. Alive. Sweating. Different. The parade continued. Jesus walked. Candles glowed. Hymns were sung. But something was wrong. Every few steps, Brother Thomas glanced ahead, his eyes wide, tracking something only he could see. Caleb followed his gaze. Footprints appeared in the snow before Jesus reached them. Bare footprints. Bleeding. Leading the way. That night, Caleb's daughter woke screaming. She said a man stood at the foot of her bed. He told me I was next, she sobbed. He said Jesus always follows. Caleb didn't sleep. At 3:12 a.m., church bells rang again. Not the carillon. The funeral bells. Slow. Deliberate. Outside, footprints appeared in the snow again. This time, they stopped at Caleb's front door. And someone knocked. Once. Twice. 3 times. A voice whispered through the wood. It's not my turn anymore. Caleb did not open the door. He stood frozen in the dark hallway, his hand hovering inches from the knob, listening to the slow rhythm of breathing on the other side. It wasn't heavy or rushed. It was calm. Patient. As if whoever stood there knew exactly how long it would take him to decide. His daughter whimpered behind him. Daddy, he's still there. The whisper came again, softer now, almost kind. It's not my turn anymore. Caleb backed away from the door and locked himself in his daughter's room until morning. When daylight finally bled through the curtains, the street outside was empty. No footprints. No marks in the snow. Just silence. The town pretended nothing had happened. The church issued a statement by noon. A medical emergency. A miscommunication. Jonah Pike's appearance was dismissed as a cruel prank by an outsider who resembled him. The parade would continue as planned next year. No one believed it. People avoided Main Street. Children refused to sleep alone. And those who had stood closest to Jonah that night all shared the same dream. They were walking in the parade. But Jesus was not with them. Only Jonah. leading them somewhere else. Caleb began asking questions. He went to the Pike family first. Jonah's parents had moved away after the funeral, but their old house still stood, dark and untouched. Inside, dust lay thick, except for one room, Jonah's bedroom. Someone had been there recently. On the desk sat a stack of journals Caleb had never seen before. Not diaries. Logs. Dates. Times. Names. And one sentence repeated over and over, written shakier each time. "I walk first so he doesn't have to." Caleb took the journals to Margaret Hale, the oldest living member of the church council. She read in silence, her hands trembling. "You weren't supposed to find these," she said. "What is this?" Caleb demanded. "What did you do to Jonah?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "We didn't do anything to him," she whispered. "We chose him." She told Caleb the truth that night. Decades ago, Blackmere Falls nearly died. Crops failed. Factories shut down. Accidents multiplied. People vanished. The church prayed for salvation, and something answered. Not God. Something that promised protection. But it demanded order. Every year, one person had to walk ahead of Jesus. Someone pure. Someone willing. Someone who would carry what the town couldn't afford to face. Their guilt. Their sickness. Their deaths. That person became the bearer. They died during the parade. And they didn't stay dead. They go first, Margaret said. So the rest of us don't have to. Jonah had been the last. Until now. Caleb staggered back from her. Why is he back? Margaret's voice broke. Because he finished carrying us. That night, the bells rang again. Not at 3:12. Earlier. 6:41 p.m. Caleb ran outside. The entire town stood frozen on their porches, staring down Main Street. Jonah Pike walked again. But he wasn't alone. Behind him walked others. Familiar faces. Former bearers. Men. Women. Teenagers. All dead. All smiling that same terrible, hollow smile. And behind them, Jesus. But he was no longer walking. He was being pulled. Dragged forward by the procession. Jonah stopped in front of Caleb's house. This time, Caleb opened the door. Jonah looked tired. "It's your turn," Jonah said gently. "You're the only one who remembers." Caleb shook his head. "I won't do it." Jonah nodded. "I didn't want to either." The ground trembled. The church bells cracked mid-ring. The procession began moving again, straight toward the church. Caleb followed. Inside, the altar split open. Beneath it was a pit, deep, endless, lined with names carved into the stone. Every bearer. Every sacrifice. The thing beneath stirred. Hungry. Jonah turned to Caleb. "If no one walks ahead," he said, "Jesus goes first." The thing screamed. Caleb understood. This was never about faith. It was about delay. Someone had to go first. Caleb stepped forward. The procession stopped. Jonah smiled, for the first time like a human. "Thank you," he whispered. Caleb walked ahead of Jesus. The pit swallowed him. The altar sealed. The bells stopped. Morning came. The town breathed again. No deaths. No accidents. No nightmares. And every Christmas since, the parade continues perfectly on time. But if you arrive early, if you stand on Main Street at exactly 6:41 p.m., you'll see bare footprints in the snow. And a man walking calmly ahead of Jesus. Making sure he never has to lead. Story 3. The bells that rang without hands. The town that never forgot. No one ever left St. Aldwyn's Crossing cleanly. They left pieces behind, memories, breath, sometimes blood, but never themselves. That was the first thing my mother told me when I was a child. The second thing was never to repeat it aloud, because the town listened. I hadn't planned on coming back. 12 years had passed since the night my family fled under a sky full of falling snow and unanswered prayers. 12 years since my father woke screaming, clutching his chest, whispering a name that didn't belong to anyone we knew. Aldwyn. When the call came about my mother's stroke, I told myself this was temporary. 2 weeks. Hospital paperwork. Sell the house. Leave before December. I arrived on December 22nd. That was my mistake. The bells rang the first night at 11:47 p.m. Not midnight. Never midnight. I was standing in the motel room, room 6, the only one still rentable, when the sound crawled through the walls. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo. It pressed. Each toll landed inside my chest like a slow heartbeat that wasn't mine. The glass on the window vibrated, and for a moment I thought it was an earthquake, until I saw the street. People were coming outside. Not stumbling. Not rushing. Walking. Men, women, children. Pajamas. Nightgowns. Bare feet in snow so fresh it should have burned. No one spoke. No one looked around. They moved toward the church at the center of town like sleepwalkers answering a silent command. I stepped back from the window. The bells rang again. Somewhere far beneath the sound, I swore I heard something else, a dragging noise, slow and heavy, like wood scraping against stone. The bells stopped. Everyone froze. Then, as one, they turned around and returned to their homes. As if nothing had happened. The next morning, I asked the motel clerk about the bells. She was an older woman with pale lashes and a neck bruised purple, as if fingers had once pressed there too hard. When I mentioned the time, 11:47, her pen slipped from her hand. "You arrived late," she said quietly. "I arrived yesterday," I replied. Her eyes lifted to mine. "No," she said. "You arrived after the bells." Outside, the town was already preparing. White cloth was being tied to street lamps. Old wooden crosses, hand-carved, cracked, some still stained dark, were stacked near the church doors. Pine branches were nailed to fences upside down, needles pointing toward the earth. And there it was. The Jesus figure. Life-sized. Too detailed. Too human. It leaned against the brick wall, face covered with burlap stitched shut at the eyes. My stomach tightened. I remembered it now. We were always told not to look at its face until the parade began. "Because he looks back," Father Harlan used to say. Father Harlan disappeared the winter I turned 16. The town never filed a missing persons report. I found Caleb Maris behind the town hall, smoking with shaking hands. He hadn't aged well. None of them had. Faces stretched thin, eyes sunken like they hadn't slept properly in years. "You came back," he said flatly. "I didn't mean to stay," I replied. "That's what everyone says." When I asked about the parade, his cigarette snapped in half between his fingers. "They changed it," he whispered. "Changed what?" "The timing. The bells. The order." He leaned closer. "They let the bells ring early last year." I remembered my father's last Christmas in St. Aldwyn's. How he sat awake all night, staring at the clock, whispering prayers backward. "What happens if they ring too early?" I asked. Caleb swallowed. "Then something wakes up before it's ready." By Christmas Eve, the town felt wrong, like a place holding its breath. Snow fell heavy and thick, muting sound. Streetlights dimmed on their own. At 11:30 p.m., the people gathered, dressed in white robes stitched with red thread that formed symbols I didn't recognize, but my body did. They weren't crosses. They were warnings. The Jesus figure was lifted onto the platform. The burlap came off. I nearly screamed. The face wasn't carved. It was preserved. The scar along the cheek. The bent nose. The hollow eyes. Father Harlan. Or what remained of him. Caleb stood beside me, whispering through clenched teeth. "It's not a statue," he said. "It never was." The bells rang. Once. Twice. Then a third time, too close together. A ripple of fear passed through the crowd, but no one moved. The platform lurched forward. And then. The head turned. Slowly. Eyes opened. And locked onto mine. The bells rang again. And beneath them, I heard footsteps that didn't belong to the procession. A man walked barefoot through the snow ahead of the platform, robe dark, hem soaked. He carried nothing. He stopped beneath the bell tower. The bells fell silent. The ropes began to sway on their own. The man lifted his head. And spoke with a voice that did not belong to one throat. "You rang too soon." Inside the church, something massive shifted. Below the snow, something answered. And every light in St. Aldwyn's Crossing went out. The darkness did not fall all at once. It collapsed. Streetlights didn't flicker, they died, snapping into blackness like severed nerves. The crowd gasped as one, not in panic, but in recognition. They had seen this before. Not often. Not safely. Snow continued to fall, glowing faintly, as if reflecting a light no longer there. And beneath our feet, something moved. Not an earthquake. Not settling ground. It was deliberate. A pressure rose from below the church, slow and immense, as though the earth itself was breathing upward. The bell ropes swayed harder now, scraping against stone, ringing without rhythm. I tried to step back. My legs refused. The man beneath the bell tower, the barefoot one, lifted his arms. The sleeves of his robe slid down, revealing wrists scarred so deeply the flesh looked folded inward, as if bound for years. Caleb whispered beside me, voice breaking. "That's not a man." The church doors opened. Not pushed. Not pulled. They bent outward, hinges screaming as something inside forced space for itself. Cold air rushed out, carrying the scent of damp earth, old blood, and something older, something that had never known air. The crowd dropped to their knees. All except me. Inside the church, the floor had split open. Not cracked. Peeled apart. A spiral stair descended into darkness that didn't absorb light, it swallowed it. From below came the sound of chains shifting, of wood creaking under impossible weight. The Jesus figure on the platform began to tremble. Father Harlan's preserved mouth opened. And screamed. Not a human scream. A warning. The barefoot man spoke again, voice layered, overlapping itself. The town was built on a promise. The bells rang once. The promise was broken. Twice. And now, it must be paid. Caleb grabbed my arm, nails digging into my skin. "They never tell the children," he whispered. "They let them believe it's celebration." The platform lurched as ropes tightened around the Jesus figure's wrists and ankles, pulled by townspeople whose eyes were glassy, mouths murmuring prayers that didn't match any Bible. "The parade isn't to honor him," Caleb continued. "It's to remind it." Below the church, something rose higher. The stairwell widened, stretching, bones of the building snapping like dry twigs. A hand emerged. Not flesh. Not stone. Something like layered bark and bone fused together, fingers too many, joints bending the wrong direction. The bells rang again. Too fast. Panic finally broke through the crowd. People screamed. Some ran. Some froze. The barefoot man turned toward me. Its face was wrong, features rearranged, mouth stitched shut except for a vertical slit that opened and closed as it spoke. A witness returned. My heart pounded. I didn't agree to this, I shouted. The thing tilted its head. None of you did. Caleb fell to his knees. They used to sacrifice one, he sobbed. Before the parade. Before the statue. The creature's hand gripped the edge of the church floor, pulling itself higher. Its body was vast, layered in remnants of cloth, bone, bells fused into its flesh, offerings from decades past. Who? I demanded. Caleb looked at me. The one who rang the bells. Memory hit me like ice water. My father. The night he woke screaming. The name he whispered. Aldwin. They choose someone, Caleb continued. Someone with faith strong enough to call it, and fear strong enough to obey. The Jesus figure convulsed violently. The ropes tightened. The preserved skin cracked. Blood, fresh blood, ran down the wooden platform. The creature howled. The promise holds, it roared, voice shaking the town. The bells must finish. The barefoot man turned toward the bell tower and pulled. Hard. The rope snapped. The bell fell. Straight down. Crushing him instantly. The sound it made was wrong, wet, hollow, final. Silence followed. Absolute. The creature paused. Its massive head turned toward me. Another waits. The Jesus figure's eyes locked onto mine again. And blinked. The townspeople turned slowly. Every face. Every eye. On me. Caleb whispered one last thing. If the bells stop unfinished, he said, it chooses. The church floor began to close. The creature retreated, dragging itself back below, shrieking in rage as stone sealed over it. The bells lay shattered in the snow. The lights flickered back on. Snow fell softly again. People stood. Smiled. The parade resumed. As if nothing had happened. I left St. Aldwin's Crossing before dawn. I didn't look back. But every Christmas since, at 11:47 p.m., my phone vibrates. No number. No message. Just a sound. A bell. Ringing. Once. Twice. Waiting. Story 4. The parade that demanded faith. Every Christmas Eve, the town of Red Hollow shut itself down before sunset. Stores closed early. Streetlights flickered off one by one. Curtains were drawn tight, not to keep the cold out, but to keep something else from looking in. Red Hollow was famous in nearby counties for one thing only. The Jesus Parade. People called it beautiful. Sacred. A tradition untouched for over a century. They were wrong. The parade didn't exist to celebrate Christmas. It existed to test belief. I know this because I grew up there, and because I watched what happened when belief failed. The rules were never written down, but everyone knew them. On Christmas Eve at exactly 7 p.m., every resident had to stand outside their home with a candle. Not inside. Not watching through a window. Outside, visible, silent, waiting. At 7:17 p.m., the church bells would ring 13 times. Then the parade would begin. The statue of Jesus came first, life-sized, nailed to a wooden cross mounted on wheels. It was old. Older than the church. Older than the town records. No one knew who carved it, but no one ever tried to replace it. They couldn't. Every year, someone suggested restoring the statue, fresh paint, repairs, preservation. Every one of those people either left town suddenly, or stopped being mentioned at all. The statue was wrong. Its proportions were almost human, but not quite. Arms too long. Ribcage too narrow. The crown of thorns dug deep into its head, not resting on top, but embedded, as if it had grown there. And the eyes. The eyes were glass. Not decorative glass. Watching Glass.as the parade moved through Red Hollow, people lowered their heads. Not in prayer, out of instinct. Because anyone who met the statue's gaze for too long reported the same thing afterward. They felt judged. Not forgiven. Not condemned. Measured. When I was 12, I finally asked my father why the parade mattered so much. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he said, "Do you believe in Jesus?" I said yes. I thought I did. His face tightened. "Good," he whispered. "Then don't stop believing. Not even for a second." That was the first time I felt afraid of Christmas. The second time came the year Daniel Moore lost his faith. Daniel was 19. Quiet. Smart. He'd been accepted into a university far away and spent his last summer in Red Hollow reading books that upset people. Philosophy. Science. Questions without comforting answers. By December, he'd stopped attending church. On Christmas Eve, he still stood outside like everyone else, but when the statue passed his house, he didn't bow his head. He stared. The parade halted. The wheels beneath the cross stopped turning on their own. The bells rang once, sharp, wrong. The statue's head turned. Wood creaked like joints being forced awake. The glass eyes locked onto Daniel, and the candle in his hands went out though the wick was untouched. No one moved. No one screamed. The priest stepped forward, pale and shaking, and spoke the words no one wanted to hear. "Do you believe?" Daniel swallowed. I don't know anymore. That was enough. The cross tilted forward. Not fell, leaned, as if choosing him. Shadows gathered beneath it, stretching too long, pooling around Daniel's feet. Hands rose from the darkness, hands made of ash, splinters, old fingernails. Daniel screamed then. He begged. He prayed. But belief demanded certainty, not desperation. The shadows pulled him under the cross, folding him into the space behind it, into a place that didn't exist a moment before. When the parade resumed, Daniel was gone. No blood. No marks. No sign he'd ever been there. By morning, his house was empty. Photos showed strangers. School records erased his name. Only those who witnessed the parade remembered him, and we were careful never to speak it aloud. That was the dark truth behind the Jesus parade. It didn't honor faith. It consumed doubt. And every year, the statue grew slightly heavier. Slightly warmer. As if something inside it was learning how to move. I left Red Hollow the following spring. But belief doesn't stay behind when you do. Every Christmas Eve at 7:17 p.m., no matter where I am, I hear bells. And I wonder who the parade will choose next. I tried to convince myself that leaving Red Hollow meant leaving it all behind. But Christmas came every year like a reminder that some things follow. That year, I returned for research, pretending to write about folk traditions, but in truth, I wanted to see the statue, to understand what had happened to Daniel, to face the fear that never let me go. The town hadn't changed. The same snow-dusted streets, shuttered windows, and empty playgrounds. Only the church seemed more alive than I remembered, its stained glass glowing faintly in the evening cold. I arrived at 6:45 p.m., heart hammering. People were already outside, candles in hand. I noticed that they didn't speak. Not a word. Faces rigid. Eyes forward. Hands trembling just enough to keep the candles from burning out. At exactly 7:17 p.m., the bells tolled 13 times. And then it began. The statue moved with an unnatural grace. Its wooden feet slid across the street without wheels, shadowless beneath its robe. The crown of thorns seemed to breathe, pulsing with dark light. I stayed back, watching, trying not to look. But the eyes, the glass eyes found me. Not because I wanted them to, not because I was part of the parade. But because they knew me. The shadows began forming long before they reached the people. Twisting black shapes that curled around the knees and ankles of the faithful, pulling gently, testing. Anyone who wavered, who doubted for even a second, was swallowed silently. No screams, no struggle, just absence. I saw Mrs. Caldwell, the baker, falter. The shadow clutched her ankle. She gasped, bowed her head in obedience, and the shadow receded. But Daniel's memory flickered across my mind, no second chances. The statue stopped in front of me. The cold radiated from it, thick and suffocating. I could see the grain of the wood, the almost human tension in the limbs, the way the nails in the hands glinted with something wet, not rust, not blood, but alive. It tilted its head slightly. That was all it needed. I felt my mind twist, doubts surfacing, questions I hadn't asked in years. "Do you believe?" the air seemed to whisper. Not from lips. From the world itself. The shadows thickened, coiling closer, tasting uncertainty. I fell to my knees. I repeated every prayer I could remember. Every phrase, every word, even the ones I had long abandoned. Candle shaking in my hand, ice biting my fingers. The statue's eyes softened, almost imperceptibly, and then it moved on, wheels silently turning under its robe, shadows retreating. The townspeople shivered but remained. I stayed on my knees long after the parade passed. My candle guttered, then burned steady again. By morning, I knew the town had survived another year. But something inside me had changed. I understood the truth too well now. The Jesus parade wasn't about faith, devotion, or celebration. It was a living entity, sustained by fear, belief, and the willingness to obey. And every year, it learned who was weak, who wavered, and who could be taken. I left Red Hollow that day, but I never left it behind. Every Christmas Eve since, I wake at 7:17 p.m. I hear the bells in the distance, faint but unmistakable. I see shadows in the corners of my room. I feel the pull of the parade calling me back. I write this as a warning. Faith alone isn't enough. Doubt is dangerous. Curiosity is fatal. If you ever hear bells ringing 13 times on Christmas Eve, if a statue of Jesus passes before your window, do not look into its eyes. Because belief is no longer a choice. It is a demand. And Red Hollow is always watching. Story 5. The Dark March of the Christmas Jesus Parade. The town of Red Hollow, New York was known for one thing every December, the Christmas Jesus Parade. Tourists came for the lights, the marching bands, and the illusion of small-town cheer. Locals, however, spoke of it in hushed tones. Not about the crowds or the performances, but about what no outsider ever saw. I moved to Red Hollow to cover the parade for a local news outlet. The morning was crisp, the streets glittered with frost, and everyone smiled like nothing lurked beneath the twinkle of the lights. But as soon as I stepped off the bus, I felt it, an oppressive weight, like the air itself was pressing down, urging me to leave. The parade began at dusk. A massive wooden Jesus statue, carried on the shoulders of volunteers, led the procession. Children sang hymns, and the choir's voices echoed across the empty storefronts. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd. The faces in the crowd weren't looking at the statue. They were staring through it. Eyes glazed, pale, almost translucent. Their mouths moved in perfect rhythm with the choir, but some weren't singing. Some weren't alive. A chill ran down my spine. I pulled out my camera. Through the lens, the statue seemed to breathe. Subtle movements, like the flicker of a living thing. Its painted eyes shone unnaturally, reflecting the lanterns in the hands of townspeople who weren't blinking. I lowered the camera, telling myself it was a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The parade wound through the streets, and the crowd began chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Not Latin. Not anything I'd heard. My recorder picked it up clearly, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the cobblestones themselves. It made my teeth ache. Then I noticed the children. One by one, they stopped walking. They fell in perfect alignment with the others, heads bowed, eyes darkened, mouths moving in unison with the chant. Panic set in. I turned to leave, but the streets behind me had changed. Snow-dusted storefronts seemed taller, narrower. The streetlights flickered violently, elongating shadows that weren't mine. When I tried to backtrack, the crowd had closed around me. Faces blank, hands outstretched. The volunteers carrying the statue didn't look human, they had hollowed eyes, skin like wax, and every step synchronized with a rhythm that wasn't natural. My heart pounded in my throat. A voice whispered in my ear, though no one was close enough to speak. "You came to watch. Now you'll lead." I spun, but the street was empty. Only the statue remained. Its eyes met mine. It smiled. Slowly, deliberately. I stumbled backward and almost fell into the gutter. When I looked up, the statue was no longer on the shoulders of the volunteers. It was walking on its own, gliding above the ground. Every footstep in the snow was silent. Every step brought it closer. Behind me, the chant intensified, now sounding like hundreds of voices merged into one, resonating inside my skull. I ran. I didn't know where, only away from that glowing, moving wooden idol. Doors opened on storefronts, lights flickered on, but no one appeared. The crowd was still there, surrounding the statue, moving as one. I felt like I had entered another world. I darted into an alley and collapsed behind a trash bin, gasping, hands shaking, eyes straining to see. The snow fell harder. Footsteps echoed, not mine. Heavy, deliberate, crushing the snow. And then, above the crunch, I heard a low creaking sound, like a hinge on a massive door opening. I peeked out. The statue was towering above the alley, impossibly tall, its eyes glowing red. It leaned forward, whispering words I didn't comprehend but somehow understood. Words of devotion. Words that demanded obedience. Words that threatened death for anyone who resisted. And then, something in the crowd began to move differently. People who were static, staring at the statue, started turning their heads toward me. Not slowly. Perfectly synchronized. Their faces blank, eyes hollow, mouths moving as if repeating the chant. I tried to scream, but the alley swallowed my voice. I ran blindly, taking every alley, every back street, only to find myself back in the main parade route. The statue was closer, impossibly large, and the crowd closed in. Lanterns flickered out, leaving me in darkness, the only sound my panicked breathing and the unrelenting chant vibrating through my bones. And then I woke up. In my bed. Curtains drawn, nothing out of place. My recorder by the side, battery dead. The news report I had drafted. All the footage was gone, replaced with a single frame, the statue, smiling, eyes glowing faint red. A whisper echoed faintly from my phone speaker, "Next year, you'll carry it." Didn't sleep well that night. Every shadow in my apartment seemed heavier, every creak of the floorboards a warning. The dream, or whatever it had been, haunted me with uncanny clarity. I kept replaying the moment the statue had glided toward me, the chant vibrating through the snow, the blank faces of the crowd. The next morning, I went out to buy coffee, trying to convince myself it was a nightmare amplified by exhaustion. But Red Hollow was different. The streets were emptier than usual. Storefronts were shuttered, the snow on the sidewalks undisturbed, as if the town had collectively decided to pause. I noticed that the usual chatter of early risers was missing. The silence was unnatural. At the diner, I tried to engage with the locals. Rough night? I asked the barista, a young man with tired eyes. He looked at me, unblinking, and shook his head. Parade's tomorrow night. You'll see for yourself. I frowned. Tomorrow night? You mean, tonight, right? The Christmas Jesus parade? His expression didn't change. It's always at dusk. Always the same. Always. His voice trailed off, and he looked toward the window, lips moving silently as though reciting the chant from my nightmare. Unease grew inside me. I had to know. I had to see if it would happen again. As night fell, I stationed myself on a rooftop overlooking the parade route. From above, everything looked ordinary at first: lanterns, floats, small groups of townspeople gathering. But the closer dusk came, the more unnatural it felt. Shadows moved against the flow of light. A windless chill pressed against my skin. And then, from the main square, I saw it. The Jesus statue. This time, it wasn't on shoulders. It hovered just above the snow, gliding silently toward the center of the street. Its eyes glowed faintly, and a pale mist poured from its feet, curling around the crowd. The people, hundreds of them, stopped in place. Their eyes glazed over, mouths moving in the same incomprehensible chant as last night. But now, some faces twisted unnaturally, muscles pulling at angles that shouldn't exist. I raised my camera. The statue seemed aware of me this time. Its gaze pierced through the lens. A smile spread across its carved face, wider than any human mouth could manage. The chant swelled, the sound vibrating through my chest, rattling my ribs. Suddenly, the crowd moved as one, shifting toward the statue. And then, impossibly, the snow beneath them began to stir, forming humanoid shapes. Twisted, faceless, pale figures emerged from the ground, joining the chant. My camera caught it all, but the feed flickered, distorted with static. I tried to descend from the roof, but the alleys were blocked. Every street led back to the square. Panic rose as I realized there was no escape. The statue levitated higher, and from its mouth came words I could understand clearly this time. Those who watch shall join. Those who resist shall carry the burden. The ground shook. Lanterns toppled, windows shattered. People screamed, but the sound was absorbed by the chant. I stumbled backward and fell into a hidden alley, gasping for air. The shadows twisted. The snow figures pressed closer. And then, from behind, I heard it, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. I turned. A man, or something resembling a man, stood there. His eyes were empty sockets glowing red. He wore a uniform like a parade volunteer. His mouth moved, but no sound came. And then he lifted his hand, pointing directly at me. I felt an invisible force yank me forward. The square was before me. The crowd, the hovering statue, the chanting figures, all frozen for a heartbeat as if acknowledging my arrival. I realized the truth: the parade wasn't just a ritual. It was a harvesting. Every year, the statue claimed new vessels, feeding on devotion, fear, and awe, twisting them into eternal followers. I ran toward the edge of the square, trying to fight the pull. But a shadow grasped my ankle, dragging me into the crowd. Faces blurred, mouths open, chanting. The statue's eyes locked on mine. I fell to the snow. My camera skidded across the street, recording everything: the snow figures bending toward me, the townspeople's faces melting into grotesque masks, and the statue descending like a nightmare made real. Then silence. I woke in my apartment, drenched in sweat. The morning sun filtered through the curtains. The streets of Red Hollow seemed normal again. No snow figures, no hovering statue, no chanting crowd. My camera lay at my feet, the memory card missing. I left Red Hollow the next day, vowing never to return. But the memory lingered. Months later, a news clip appeared online, the Christmas Jesus Parade. Red Hollow, New York. Hundreds of people gathered, smiling, waving. And in the center, the statue. Its eyes, they glowed faintly red, watching, waiting. And somewhere in the crowd, I could have sworn I saw my own face, frozen in devotion. Story 6. The dark ritual behind the Christmas Jesus Parade. It was supposed to be a celebration of faith and joy, but the Jesus Parade in the small town of St. Hollow, New York, had always carried whispers of something off. I had moved to the area for the holidays, curious about this long-running Christmas tradition. Locals spoke of it as an event that drew hundreds each year, a spectacle of lights, costumes, and nativity reenactments. But from the first moment I arrived, I could feel a weight in the air, something colder than winter, heavier than snow. The streets of St. Hollow were lined with dilapidated brick buildings, many abandoned, their windows dark and broken. The townspeople were friendly, smiling and waving as they decorated, but their eyes always seemed to flicker toward the shadowed alleyways. Even the cheerful strains of Christmas carols sounded hollow, echoing with a subtle, almost imperceptible undertone that made my skin crawl. The parade began at dusk. Giant floats of angels and saints glided through the streets, while actors dressed as shepherds and kings processed alongside them. Children laughed, their faces painted with joy, but every so often, one would stop, staring blankly at a corner of the crowd, as if someone or something unseen had caught their attention. By the second hour, I noticed patterns. People weren't just watching the parade, they were watching something else. A pale man in tattered robes moved along the edges of the crowd, never speaking, never blinking, yet somehow always in the right place at the right time. Every few minutes, his head would tilt unnaturally, almost like he was listening to a conversation that hadn't been spoken. I followed him through the side streets, keeping to the shadows, and found myself in front of the old St. Gabriel's Church, a building that had been abandoned for decades. Its doors, usually locked, were slightly ajar tonight, creaking in the wind. From inside came faint chanting, low, guttural, almost like the choir of a funeral. Curiosity overcame caution. I pushed the door and stepped inside. The church was dimly lit by flickering candlelight. Around the nave, the pale man and several others, people who weren't in the parade, stood in a circle, heads bowed. In the center was a crude altar, draped in crimson cloth that seemed stained, not just with dust but something darker, something wet. And upon the altar, a small figure, carved to resemble Jesus, but its eyes were tiny black holes, its mouth twisted in a silent scream. Around it, symbols had been etched into the wood and floor, unfamiliar glyphs that pulsed faintly with a reddish glow, as though alive. A sudden whisper slithered through the air, "He comes for those who watch too closely." I froze. Every instinct screamed to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The circle of figures began moving, stepping in slow, deliberate patterns, their chanting rising into a high-pitched crescendo. Shadows along the walls seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally, crawling toward me like liquid darkness. A sudden crash behind me made me spin. The door had shut. The candlelight flickered violently, plunging the church into darkness, and I felt cold hands brush against my shoulders. A voice, deep and rasping, whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't have seen this." I bolted, breaking through the nearest wall of shadow, bursting through the front doors just as the parade's final float passed. The townspeople cheered, oblivious to the horrors happening in their own streets. The pale man was nowhere to be seen, vanished into the crowd as though he had never existed. I spent the rest of the night hiding in a side alley, listening. From the church came a low hum, like the heartbeat of something immense and patient. And above it, faint but distinct, the whispers of children repeating lines I hadn't taught them, lines from the carved figure's twisted mouth. When dawn broke, the parade ended, and the town returned to its sleepy calm. But the shadows in the alleys didn't vanish. I could feel them watching, waiting. And I knew one thing: next year, the parade would return, and whatever haunted St. Hollow would come back too, hungrier than before. The bells rang again. Not church bells, these were wrong. Too slow. Too heavy. Each toll vibrated through the frozen streets of Hollow Creek, rattling windows and bones alike. Daniel Reyes stumbled backward as the massive Jesus float creaked to life. Its wooden wheels, silent for decades, began to turn. No one was pushing it. The robed figures surrounding the float raised their heads in perfect unison. Their faces were pale, stretched tight as if their skin didn't quite belong to them. Eyes blackened, reflecting nothing. Smiles carved too deep. Father Mallory stepped forward. "The final witness has arrived," he said calmly. "Begin the procession." The crowd, neighbors Daniel had known his entire life, moved as one. No cheering. No laughter. Only the sound of synchronized footsteps crunching through ice-covered streets. Daniel ran. He sprinted down Main Street, breath tearing at his lungs. Christmas lights flickered overhead, but now he saw the truth: the bulbs weren't decorative. They were seals. Each light blinked in a deliberate rhythm, matching the bell tolls. A containment spell woven across the town. The air grew colder with every step, frost forming instantly on his eyelashes. Behind him, the parade followed. Slow. Inevitable. The Jesus figure on the float began to move its head. Wood creaked like breaking bones. Its carved eyes turned and locked onto Daniel. A voice poured from the statue's mouth, many voices layered together, ancient and starving. "Do not flee. You were chosen." Daniel tripped, slamming onto the ice. His camera skidded ahead, stopping at the feet of a woman standing alone on the sidewalk. Mrs. Harper. She had gone missing 10 years ago. Her skin was gray, translucent. Veins glowed faintly beneath it like dying embers. "They never let us rest," she whispered, helping him up with hands colder than death. "Every Christmas, they give us back." Daniel's stomach dropped. "The missing people," he said. "They're not dead," she interrupted. "Not alive either. We're the offerings." The bells rang louder. Mrs. Harper dragged Daniel through a side alley toward the old church. Its doors swung open before they touched them. Inside, the floor had been torn away. Beneath the altar yawned a massive pit lined with bones, rotted nativity figures, and broken crosses. Symbols carved into the stone walls pulsed with dull red light. "This town was built on a breach," Mrs. Harper said. "Something ancient tried to cross over long ago. The founders trapped it, but trapping requires feeding." The bells stopped. Silence pressed in. Father Mallory appeared at the edge of the pit, his robe soaked with blackened blood. "You were never meant to film us," he said softly. "But the ritual requires a witness. A storyteller. Someone who will spread the memory." Daniel raised his camera with shaking hands. "What happens if I refuse?" Mallory smiled. "You already didn't." The pit stirred. Something vast shifted beneath the stone, too large to fully emerge. Shadows stretched upward, forming limbs that bent at impossible angles. A mouth opened in the darkness, lined with teeth shaped like broken halos. The Jesus statue rolled in through the church doors, now fully animate. It stepped off the float. Wood split. Flesh pulsed beneath it. The figure knelt at the pit's edge and pressed its hands into the stone, bleeding sap-black blood. "Feed us," the thing below whispered. The townspeople filed inside, one by one. They removed their robes. Underneath, their chests were carved with the same symbol Daniel had seen on the float. Old scars. Fresh wounds. Generations of devotion. Mrs. Harper squeezed Daniel's arm. "You can stop it," she said. "But only by replacing us." Mallory held out a ceremonial dagger, its blade humming. "Take your place," he urged. "Become eternal. Become Hollow Creek." Daniel looked at the pit. At the statue. At the dead who weren't allowed to die. Then he lifted his camera, and threw it into the darkness. The pit screamed. The seals flickered. The lights across town exploded. Hollow Creek burned. The church collapsed inward, sealing the breach once more. The parade vanished. The missing townspeople turned to ash in the falling snow. Daniel was found at dawn, unconscious in the ruins. Authorities ruled it a gas explosion. No parade was mentioned. No church record survived. But every Christmas since, Daniel receives a package with no return address. Inside is always the same thing. A small wooden figurine of Jesus. And each year, it's a little closer to moving.
Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Terramouth.